Story 1. New Year's Eve was never my favorite holiday. The loud parties, confetti showers, and countdowns surrounded by people, whether friends or strangers, felt draining to me. Instead, I'd always craved moments of peace and reflection, a chance to disconnect from the noise of the world. As a photographer, nature had always been my muse. Its quiet majesty had a way of grounding me, giving me a sense of clarity and purpose. So, as the year turned to 2024, I decided to skip the usual celebrations and do what I loved most: hike into the Appalachian wilderness near Asheville, North Carolina, camera in hand. The day carried a crisp chill, the kind that bites at your nose and cheeks but fills your lungs with fresh vigor. I packed light, just my trusted Nikon camera, a thermos of hot coffee, some granola bars, and a flashlight. I had chosen a relatively short trail that led to an overlook promising breathtaking views of the Blue Ridge Mountains. My plan was simple: capture the sunset, sip my coffee, and maybe stick around long enough to photograph the stars. The trail was peaceful, exactly what I'd hoped for. There wasn't a soul in sight, and the stillness of the forest felt like a comforting blanket. Solitude had always been my reset button, and I embraced the quiet as I made my way deeper into the woods. As the sun began its descent, the forest was bathed in warm, golden light. By the time I reached the overlook, the view was nothing short of spectacular. Rolling hills stretched out into the horizon, their curves painted in hues of orange and purple. It was as though the world had slowed down just for me, offering a private masterpiece to photograph. I set up my tripod and let the magic of the changing light guide my shots. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the landscape, and the sky slowly shifted from fiery gold to a softer twilight blue. It was one of those moments where time seemed to lose all meaning. But as the final rays of sunlight disappeared and the first stars began to emerge, I noticed something strange. Just beyond the edge of the overlook, among the trees, there were figures. At first I dismissed them as oddly shaped shadows, but as I adjusted my camera's focus, the truth became unnervingly clear. There were people standing among the trees about 50 feet away. They were wearing masks, grotesque ones. Not the kind you'd buy at a party store, but hand-carved, detailed masks that were both eerie and unsettling. Some resembled exaggerated animal features, while others had distorted human faces, twisted in ways that made them look inhuman. They didn't move, they didn't speak, they simply stood there watching. "Happy New Year," I muttered under my breath, trying to shake off the creeping unease. I decided to pack up my gear and head back down the trail. As I walked, the forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening into shapes that my mind couldn't quite ignore. Then I heard it: footsteps. At first they were faint, almost imperceptible. I stopped, turning my flashlight toward the sound, but the trail behind me was empty. Only the wind whispered through the trees. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe the sound of twigs snapping under an animal's weight, but the footsteps grew louder, closer. I stopped again, whipping the flashlight around. This time, at the edge of the illuminated area, something moved. It wasn't a deer. "Hello?" I called out, my voice thin and trembling. The silence that followed was deafening, a weight pressing down on me. No response, no rustling of leaves, just an oppressive stillness. I walked faster, my heart pounding. The once familiar trail now felt foreign, as though it were stretching into something unending. The markers I'd noted earlier, a split tree, a moss-covered boulder, were harder to spot in the dark. Then I saw them again. The masked figures had returned, but this time they weren't scattered in the distance, they were closer, just off the trail. My flashlight caught glimpses of them, antlers on one mask, streaks of what looked like dried blood on another. Their forms were still, yet brimming with silent intent. There were more of them now, at least 8 or 9. They weren't just standing, they were waiting. "What do you want?" I yelled, my voice cracking with fear. They didn't answer. Of course, they didn't. They just stood there, their masks tilted, as if scrutinizing me, and then they moved. Not in a rush, but in unison, stepping forward, closer to the trail. I didn't wait to see what they wanted. Pure adrenaline kicked in, and I bolted down the trail. The flashlight's beam jittered wildly with each step, casting shadows that seemed to mock my fear. Branches clawed at my jacket, roots threatened to trip me, but I kept running. Behind me, their footsteps followed, not hurried, but steady and relentless. It was as if they knew I couldn't escape them. When I finally burst out of the tree line into the parking lot, a wave of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. My car, parked alone at the edge of the lot, was now blocked by a makeshift barricade of logs and branches. No, I whispered, fumbling with my keys as panic set in. I sprinted to the car, threw myself inside, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly that it took 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. When the headlights flicked on, they illuminated the figures emerging from the woods. They stood at the edge of the lot, their masks glowing in the beams. Slowly, they started walking toward me. "Screw it," I muttered, throwing the car into gear. The tires screeched as the car slammed into the barrier. Wood splintered and branches crunched under the wheels as the car jolted violently. I didn't care about the damage, I just needed to get out of there. By the time I reached the safety of the road, the rearview mirror showed nothing but darkness. Somehow, that emptiness felt worse than if I'd seen them following me. The next morning, my car was a mess. Scratches across the paint, a cracked headlight, and dents in the bumper. Over coffee, I told my friend Derek what had happened. He listened intently, then pulled out his phone. "Dude, have you heard about that YouTube channel? They do creepy Appalachian trail pranks," he said, showing me a clip. My stomach dropped. The masks, the woods, it all matched. "You think it was them?" I asked, feeling both relief and anger. "Only one way to find out," he said, pulling up their contact info. I emailed the channel, describing what happened. A few hours later, they replied, "Yeah, that was us. Sorry if we freaked you out. We didn't think anyone would actually be hiking that late. We can cover the damage to your car, just let us know the repair cost." I didn't know how to feel. On one hand, it wasn't a sinister cult or supernatural force. On the other, they deliberately terrorized me for content. I sent them the repair estimate and left it at that. Even now though, the memory of those masks lurking in the dark still sends chills down my spine. Joke or not, some experiences stick with you. Story 2. Being a lawyer often means your life is consumed by the demands of clients, court dates, paperwork, and emails that never seem to stop flooding in. By the time New Year's Eve rolled around, I was completely drained. I had spent so many nights working late into the evening that I felt I needed a break, a real one. So I decided to spend this New Year's Eve alone in my apartment, avoiding the chaotic parties, the noise, and the crowds. I wasn't in the mood for socializing. Instead, I craved peace and solitude. I prepared a simple dinner, something light but comforting, and poured myself a glass of wine. Settling down on the couch, I curled up with a good book and enjoyed the quiet hum of the city outside. From my apartment on the 15th floor, I had a perfect view of the Seattle skyline. The Space Needle stood tall against the night sky, surrounded by a sea of twinkling lights. My balcony was always my favorite part of the apartment. While the space itself wasn't particularly large, the view made up for it. On New Year's Eve, the city came alive with fireworks that lit up the sky, and I had front row seats from my little perch on the balcony. It felt like the perfect night to recharge, surrounded by the beauty of the city, but entirely removed from the chaos. The evening was exactly as I had hoped. The wine was good, the book was absorbing, and I could hear the faint sounds of celebration from the streets below, laughter, music, and fireworks popping in the distance. It gave the night a festive buzz without intruding on my solitude. As midnight drew closer, I decided to step out onto the balcony to watch the fireworks. I wrapped a soft, warm blanket around my shoulders, the crisp night air hitting me as soon as I opened the door. The cold was sharp, but somehow refreshing. It made the night feel alive. From where I stood, I could see all of Seattle, its streets twinkling with festive lights, the towering buildings, and the distant Space Needle, its spire shimmering against the backdrop of the stars. It was during that moment of stillness, with the city below me and the sky above, that I saw him. Across the way, on the balcony of the adjacent high-rise, a figure stood motionless. At first, it didn't seem too strange. People are often out on their balconies, especially on New Year's Eve, enjoying the view of the city or the fireworks, but there was something about this figure that felt off. He didn't move, didn't seem to acknowledge the world around him. He simply stood there, still and staring directly at me. His posture was rigid, and it made my pulse quicken in a way I couldn't quite explain. I waved politely, just a small gesture of acknowledgement. Maybe it was a neighbor I hadn't met yet. After all, the apartment next door had been empty for months, so I assumed someone must have recently moved in, but the figure didn't respond. He didn't wave back. Instead, he just stood there, watching. For a moment, I tried to shake off the strange feeling creeping up my spine. Maybe he was shy. Maybe he was just lost in thought, distracted by the view or the fireworks. I couldn't let my imagination get the best of me, so I turned my attention back to the fireworks. Midnight arrived and the sky exploded with color. The fireworks were beautiful, and for a while I forgot all about the figure across the way. The moment felt magical, the city alive with celebration. But as the last of the fireworks began to fizzle out and the sound of the crowd below began to fade, I looked back to where the figure had been, and there he was, still standing on the balcony, unmoving, watching. A cold knot formed in my chest. My stomach twisted with unease, but I tried to brush it off. It wasn't as if he was doing anything. Still, the sensation of being watched settled deep within me. I stepped back inside and locked the balcony door, pulling the curtains tightly across. It felt like I needed a barrier between me and the emptiness outside. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that I had overreacted. After all, people can be strange sometimes, especially on New Year's Eve. Maybe the person was drunk, or maybe they just didn't realize how creepy it had been to stand there, motionless, staring at me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to call the building manager. I had never met the new tenant next door, and I thought maybe I could introduce myself. When I reached the manager, she sounded surprised when I mentioned the apartment next door. "That unit is still unoccupied," she said, a little puzzled. "We haven't rented it out yet." I was taken aback. I paused before speaking again. "Are you sure? Because there was someone on the balcony last night. I saw them." There was a brief silence, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "That doesn't make sense. There shouldn't be anyone there," she replied. Her voice was tinged with concern. Goosebumps crept up my neck and my stomach dropped. "Could someone have broken in?" I asked, my voice suddenly small and uncertain. "I'll send maintenance to check," she said, her tone now a mix of concern and skepticism. "But if you're feeling unsafe, maybe you should call the police." After hanging up, I felt an icy chill run through me. I stood by the window, staring at the curtains that separated me from the empty balcony. Part of me wanted to look, to see if the figure had returned, but another part of me was too afraid to face whatever might be waiting outside. Eventually, I mustered the courage to draw the curtains aside. For a second, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it had all been a figment of my imagination. But as I peered outside, I saw that the balcony was empty, just as it should be. For a moment, relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. That feeling of being watched lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. That evening, as night fell again, I found myself constantly glancing out the window, my heart racing with anticipation. I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure would return at around 10 p.m. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called the police. They promised to send an officer to check it out. While I waited, I sat in the dark, trying to make myself as small as possible in the corner of the room where I could see the balcony without being seen. The shadows outside felt alive, shifting and swirling, making my tired eyes play tricks on me. When the police arrived, they were thorough. They inspected the neighboring apartment, but it was empty, as it should have been. No signs of forced entry. They assured me the building was secure. "If anything else happens, don't hesitate to call us," one of the officers said, but their words didn't comfort me. In fact, I felt more unsettled than ever. It wasn't just the empty balcony that had me on edge. It was the feeling that something had been watching me. The sense of unease lingered, a constant weight in the pit of my stomach. The next morning, I made up my mind. I emailed my landlord and gave my notice. I couldn't stay there any longer. The thought of stepping out onto the balcony again, feeling the weight of those unseen eyes on me, was unbearable. Within a week, I was packed and gone. I moved to a new apartment in a quieter neighborhood, one that didn't come with the ghosts of the past. Even now in my new apartment, I avoid balconies at night. I can't help it. Sometimes, I catch myself staring out the window, almost expecting to see the figure once again. It's like a haunting that refuses to fade, an image burned into my mind. If these New Year's Eve nightmares gave you chills, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more terrifying stories. What would you have done in my situation? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your survival instincts. Send this video to a friend who swears New Year's Eve is all about fun and fireworks and see if they still agree. Remember, even the happiest nights can hide the darkest dangers. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next Nightmare Story 3. New Year's Eve in New York City is like no other. The lights glimmer, the energy vibrates in the cold winter air, and there's a collective hope that comes with turning the page to a new year. After a year as tumultuous as 2019, I longed for an evening of simplicity, a moment to breathe, celebrate, and perhaps regain a sense of normalcy. My friend Rachel had invited me to a rooftop party at her apartment, and it sounded like the perfect escape. Rachel's place was the kind of apartment you dream about but rarely see in real life. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a spectacular view of the Manhattan skyline, where the city's lights sparkled like a sea of stars. The party was vibrant, buzzing with laughter and chatter. There were familiar faces, friends and colleagues I'd seen before, and strangers whose names I'd probably forget by morning. As the clock struck midnight, the energy in the room was electric. Fireworks burst between the skyscrapers, painting the night sky with streaks of color, and for a fleeting moment, I let myself believe things could feel okay again. As the night wound down and guests began to leave, I stayed behind to help Rachel clean up. We clinked the last of our champagne glasses, shared a few laughs about the evening, and then I felt the tug of exhaustion setting in. It was time to call it a night. I grabbed my coat and bag, said my goodbyes, and stepped into the hallway, ready to catch the elevator down. The hallway was dimly lit and quiet, such a stark contrast to the lively party upstairs. As I approached the elevator, I noticed a man standing near the doors scrolling on his phone. He seemed vaguely familiar, tall, with neatly combed dark hair and dressed sharply as if he'd come straight from an event. I assumed he'd been at the party. The elevator arrived with a soft ding. I stepped inside and instinctively held the door for him as he followed me in. "Thanks," he said casually. "No problem," I replied, pressing the button for the lobby. He didn't press another button, so I assumed we were headed to the same floor. The elevator began its smooth descent, and I leaned back against the wall, scrolling through my messages while he stood across from me, his hands in his pockets. For the first few seconds, everything seemed fine. Then, the elevator jolted. The movement wasn't violent, but enough to make the lights flicker briefly before the car came to a complete stop. My stomach sank as I instinctively pressed the lobby button again. Nothing. I tried the emergency call button, which chimed softly but didn't yield an immediate response. The man chuckled lightly. "Classic New York elevators, huh?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, they don't make them like they used to." Despite his seemingly relaxed demeanor, there was something about the moment, the flicker of the lights, the stillness of the air, that made the space feel smaller than it should have. After a quick call to the building's emergency line, a woman assured me that a technician was on the way. "Looks like we'll be here for a bit," I said, attempting to fill the silence with casual conversation. The man nodded, his posture still calm. "Guess so, you coming from the party upstairs?" "Yeah, you." "Something like that?" The first 10 minutes passed with basic small talk, where we worked, the unpredictable winter weather, and how crowded the party had been. But as time went on, his tone began to shift. "Do you live in the building?" he asked. "No, just visiting a friend," I replied. "You seem familiar. Weren't you wearing that red dress earlier?" His question made me pause. I wasn't wearing red. I'd been in a black sweater and jeans all evening. "No, that wasn't me," I said, forcing a polite smile. My mistake," he said, smiling faintly. But there was something in his eyes that unsettled me, a flicker of something I couldn't place. By the 30-minute mark, the small talk had evaporated, replaced by a heavy silence. I discreetly activated an emergency app on my phone which sent my location to Rachel and a few other trusted contacts. My phone buzzed almost immediately. "Rachel, what's wrong?" "Me, stuck in the elevator. Not alone. Something feels off." "Me, stuck in the elevator, not alone. Something feels off." "Rachel, want me to call someone?" "Me, already did. Just stay by your phone." I tried to focus on my phone, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The man's gaze lingered on me for just a beat too long. "You don't seem nervous," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Should I be?" I replied, keeping my tone light. He laughed softly, shaking his head, just making conversation. His casual demeanor made his next question all the more chilling. "Ever think about how vulnerable people are in elevators? You're just stuck, nowhere to run, no one to hear you scream." I stared at him, unsure of how to respond. He smiled as if he could feel the unease radiating from me. "Relax," he said, chuckling. "I'm just messing with you." I forced a laugh, but my heart raced. My grip on my phone tightened as I mentally rehearsed how I'd defend myself if things escalated further. Finally, a crackling voice came through the speaker. "Hello, can anyone hear me?" "Yes," I shouted, relief washing over me. "We're working to get the elevator moving. Hang tight, it shouldn't be much longer." For the first time, the man's expression changed. He looked irritated, almost as if the interruption had ruined something for him. When the elevator jolted back to life and the doors began to open, I instinctively stepped forward, but he moved to block my path. "Ladies first," he said, his voice low. "Thanks," I replied, edging around him cautiously. As I stepped out into the hallway, 2 maintenance workers were waiting. "You okay, miss?" one of them asked. I wanted to crumble with relief, but I forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine, thanks. I didn't waste a second." I hurried out of the building, hailed a cab, and didn't look back. Through the cab's rearview mirror, I saw the man step out of the elevator, his eyes scanning the lobby as if searching for me. I can't fully explain what happened in that elevator. Maybe he was just an eccentric guy with a dark sense of humor, or maybe his intentions were more sinister. Either way, it was a night I'll never forget. New Year's Eve is supposed to symbolize fresh starts and new beginnings. For me, it became a stark reminder of how quickly things can shift from celebratory to chilling, and how thin the line is between safety and danger. Story 4. New Year's Eve was always magical to me. The glittering decorations, the popping champagne, the collective energy as everyone counted down the seconds to midnight. It was a night where anything felt possible. As an event planner, I thrived on the chaos and excitement, and December 31st, 2021 was no exception. That year, I had coordinated one of my biggest events yet, a glamorous party in the heart of downtown Denver. From the stunning decor to the perfectly timed confetti drop at midnight, everything had gone flawlessly. The guests were thrilled, the DJ kept the dance floor packed, and even the inevitable hiccups were minor and easily handled. By the time the clock struck 1 a.m., the party was winding down. I stood near the entrance watching happy revelers stream out into the chilly night. My body was tired, but my heart was buzzing with pride. I had done it again. Grabbing a glass of champagne for myself, I toasted to another successful year and started gathering my things to head home. My apartment was only a short 15-minute walk away. The streets were still alive with celebration, filled with laughing groups and taxis honking their way through the traffic. It felt like the perfect way to close out the night. As I stepped into the cold air, I tightened my coat around me and started walking. The streets glimmered under the city lights, and fireworks crackled faintly in the distance. I was alone but surrounded by people, and that felt safe enough. About 3 blocks from the venue, I first noticed a man walking roughly 20 feet behind me. At first, it didn't seem like much. Plenty of people were heading home at that hour. Still, something about his pace was odd. It wasn't the meandering stroll of someone enjoying the festive night, nor the brisk stride of someone eager to get home. It was deliberate. I glanced back, pretending to adjust my scarf. He wore a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, his hands buried in his pockets. His face was obscured by shadow, but that wasn't unusual. It was New Year's Eve after all. Still, unease prickled at the back of my neck. I quickened my pace, my heels clicking louder against the pavement. The festive chatter of nearby groups gave me some comfort, but when I turned onto a quieter street, the noise faded and my awareness of his presence sharpened. He was still there, the same steady pace keeping him behind me. I tried to stay rational. He could be heading home in the same direction. It could all be a coincidence, but my gut was telling me otherwise. At the next intersection, I decided to test him. Instead of heading straight toward my apartment, I turned left onto a street I rarely used. My stomach sank as I heard his footsteps change direction behind me. I felt the panic rising in my chest. My thoughts raced through every true crime podcast and self-defense tip I'd ever heard. I pulled out my phone pretending to text, hoping the act of holding it would deter him. Then I called a friend, knowing full well it was too late for them to answer. "Hey, just walking home," I said loudly, forcing cheer into my voice. "Should be there in 10 minutes. See you soon." I glanced back again. He was closer now, only about 10 feet behind me. His movements were steady, focused. My heart was pounding. Spotting a convenience store up ahead, I darted inside, the bell jingling above me as the door swung shut. The fluorescent lights felt harsh after the darkness outside. "Just browsing," I said to the clerk, trying to mask my fear. I lingered by the snack aisle, peering out the window. The man had stopped outside. He leaned casually against a lamppost, not looking at the store but not moving on either. He was waiting. After a few minutes, I decided to make a break for it. I left the store and ducked into a nearby alley, weaving through the narrow path until I emerged on another street. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that I'd lost him. The rest of the walk home was a blur of adrenaline and fear. When I finally reached my building, I fumbled with my keys, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The street behind me was empty. Once inside, I bolted every lock, drew the curtains, and collapsed onto the couch, trying to calm my nerves. I was safe. It was over, or so I thought, around 3 a.m. Just as the tension in my body was beginning to ease, I heard it. A soft knock at my window. I froze. My apartment was on the second floor. The knock came again, louder this time. Slowly, I crept toward the window, every instinct screaming at me to stay silent. My hands shook as I carefully parted the curtain, just enough to see outside he was there. Standing on the fire escape, his hood pushed back to reveal a face I didn't recognize. His expression wasn't angry or desperate. It was calm, almost smug, as if he was savoring the fear he knew I felt. Backing away from the window, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My voice trembled as I whispered to the dispatcher, "Someone's outside my window. I'm on the second floor. Please hurry." The dispatcher stayed on the line, assuring me that officers were on their way. Meanwhile, the man didn't move. He just stood there, his breath fogging up the glass as he stared into my apartment. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, I heard the distant wail of sirens. His head snapped toward the sound, and without hesitation he climbed back down the fire escape and disappeared into the night. When the police arrived, they searched the area, but found no sign of him. I gave them a description: tall, late 30s, dark hoodie, but it felt useless. How many men in Denver fit that description? They advised me to stay somewhere else for the night, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Instead, I sat on my couch until dawn, every sound in my apartment setting my nerves on edge. I never saw the man again, but his presence lingered in my mind for months. For a long time, I couldn't walk alone at night. I avoided opening my curtains and jumped at every unexpected noise. It happened 3 years ago, but the memory still haunts me. I'll never forget the way his face looked through the glass, or the smugness in his expression, as though he knew how deeply he'd shaken me. New Year's Eve used to be my favorite night of the year, a time of celebration, energy, and joy. Now, it's a reminder of how easily a festive evening can turn into a nightmare, and how some strangers refuse to stay strangers.